Welcome to our next installment in Hilchos Basar B'Chalav. We are continuing to learn Basar B'Chalav, and we are in Siman Pei Tes, chapter 89, and we are continuing to talk about the issue of identifying the time when the 6 hours end. When we last left our heroes, we were discussing how to delineate the end period of the 6 hours, and we meant to say that we weren't, it's not such a strict thing that you need to know when it kind of ends and when it doesn't. But, that's for one half of it that we left it at, which was the idea that there's sort of like the flavor kind of still stays down in the pupik over here. You still feel the meat flavors coming up. But what if you still have meat between the teeth? That's what we're going to pick up today. And we're also going to look at the actual verbiage used by the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah to understand the final halacha and how the Achronim understand it. So let's say there's still some, Basar Odeno ben Shinehem, right? So we talked about how there might be a problem with that. So we quoted the Gemara in Chulin on Kuf Ham Beis. It says that Rav Acha bar Yosef spoke to Rav Chisda asking, so if there's meat still between the teeth, what's the rule on that? Okay, so we quote the pasuk Basar Odeno ben Shinehem by the Chet, and we say that the meat was still between their teeth, and Rashi explains that this could be meat to not let you eat any dairy products like cheese until it's removed. So if the meat's still there, it's still called meat. And so the Torah quotes this, but he quotes it interestingly both in Orach Chaim and Kufay and Gimel, which we've referenced a couple of times, and he quotes it here in Pei Tes, that if there's still meat between the teeth, it must be removed. So that's to say, if you find meat, not that you have to go and check for meat. So that's just sort of an important thing to kind of say. You don't have to worry about meat, it's just that there's something there, and I still feel like, it's still something there. You have to go in there, take a toothpick, take some dental floss, and get rid of it. So the Beis Yosef, the Beis Yosef is quoting this in Orach Chaim Kufay and Gimel. He says that the Rashba points out, quoting the Baal HaItur, that if there is still meat between your teeth and you've already waited your time, you have to remove it. Okay? And this is also echoed by the Rabbeinu Yerucham. So in Yoreh Deah over here, the Torah says that if it's according to the opinions that it's the flavor that is what's keeping you from eating cheese right after this meal, so after you wait 6 hours, it doesn't do that anymore. Okay? But according to the Rambam, who says it's about the waiting for the stuff to come out of your teeth, so if there's meat between the teeth, you shouldn't have to wait. So the Ran over here says that if you ate meat and then waited, and then you find meat in between the teeth, you don't actually have to wait another amount of time. Okay? So you have to wait from the end of the time period of when you ate your last meal until the next time period. That's the waiting period. However, rinsing out your mouth seems like something that would be a good idea to do. So there's this back and forth with some of the language. Okay? So we're saying that according to the Rashi's opinion, who says that the flavor is about what you feel kind of coming up from the inside. So in that case, then waiting beyond 6 hours and looking for more meat between the teeth doesn't really sound like a real problem. Okay? So that seems to be something else. But the Rambam, that's saying that the whole sugya is about the meat between the teeth. So then you need to make sure that there's no more meat between the teeth. Okay? But not that you have to look for it. So if there is some there, you have to get rid of it. And that's how the Torah learns it. And this is also stated in the Taz and the Pri Megadim. We'll bring that up again when we get to the Shulchan Aruch verbiage as well. Or the Pri Chadash has an interesting opinion. He says that you have to actually clean your teeth out. That's part of the Kinuach and Hadacha, the wiping your hands and washing your mouth out. However, the Pri Toar says that this doesn't make sense, and the Chidah also seems to say that if the tour, according to the tour that we just quoted, the Rashba with the Baal HaItur and this Rambam all seem to be saying the same thing. So how can you say that you wouldn't need to go ahead and? It sounds like the Torah is kind of saying, if there's there, you should take rid of it. It should be the other way around. You have to always make sure that all the meat is gone. Okay, so he seems to feel that you need to do that, but that's his issue. Now, going back to the Rashba for a second and the Baal HaItur. So even after 6 hours, you have to go and clean your teeth, even if you for sure have had the full 6 hours, and even if you don't see any meat in between your teeth, he seems to imply that that's the case. And other Achronim seem to say that you need to go ahead and do a full cleaning. All right, and so there's a few Achronim Shishmarim seem to say that. However, the Marshal and the Knesset Gedola, you don't have to do this, even according to these strict opinions. So that's just something to keep in mind here when we talk about it in a second about what the Shulchan Aruch and the Rama finally say. So we mentioned that before that you have to bench between the two meals. So the Marshal has an interesting statement about benching. He says that according to him, which he's saying there's a general, everyone seems to agree on this, that if you haven't concluded the meat meal yet, and it goes on all day, you still can't have your dairy, even if it goes on the whole day, okay? Because you have to have a separate Suda. And he says it's an error to think that you can be lenient on that. And the Taz, Shach, Pri Megadim, and Rabbi Kiva Eger all agree with that, as does the Magen Avraham also in Simon Kuf Sadi Gimel. Simon Kuf Sadi Daled. He actually says it Kuf Sadi Daled in Orach Chaim. Okay? And that's the same thing, even if you just had steak with it by itself without any bread. You have to say brain of fashos in that case. Now, let's say you forgot to bench, right? You had a meal, and whatever, like to happen on form, you get a little tipsy, but it's been, more than an hour and 12 minutes, so it's been more than 72 minutes. So you can't be still sitting at the same table as well as what the Kaf Chaim points out. So that's what he says. Even if you forgot the bench and you were still sitting at the same table, that would be the same issue. So you have to actually clear that table off from all the old meal before you would even be able to have the dairy meal. So let's say you made it. So here's another case of an error. Let's say you went ahead and started eating dairy before your 6 hours aided. So maybe you eat a little bit or whatever. Can you eat a little bit of it? So this question was posed to the Shevet Levi, which is Rav Wozner, who was in the Rav in the 20th century in Israel, and he's also part of the Eidah HaCharedis, and he had his own Beis Din of Rav Wozner. So if you normally wait full 6 hours, then if you made a bracha on something, then you shouldn't have to wait if you went ahead and made the bracha. And the Shevet, he then further says in another tshuva in Shevet Levi, he brings a darchei tshuva. And let's say you made a bracha on cheese after 4 hours, so you can go ahead and eat that cheese, okay? So because you can rely on the opinion of the Pri Chadash that we quoted earlier, okay, and the Sdei Chemet. So darchei tshuva himself says that if you ate something dairy before you've had your 6 hours, so if it's after 4 hours and it's the winter time, so then it's okay. So you can go ahead, since you said the bracha on your cheese already, you can go ahead and swallow it. So it wasn't necessarily, that's not necessarily an accurate quote of the darchei tshuva, and so that's just one little thing that he doesn't say that. So he says that you can go ahead and swallow it, but he doesn't make that distinction darchei tshuva makes. So Rav Moshe Sternbach in the Tshuvas and Haggis, he was the Rav of South Africa at the time before he moved to Yerushalayim and became the head of the Eidah HaCharedis, that even after 1 hour, you can go ahead and swallow the cheese or whatever. He's made the bracha, right? And so it sounds like if you went ahead and made that. So the Madnei Shulchan, okay, he says that he has an interesting approach over here. He says that if you've had at least 1 hour between the meat and then having the cheese, and you've also rinsed your mouth, okay, so either brushing or using a mouthwash, okay? And then you say something, then you say a bracha on something that's dairy. So that is when you can be lenient to go ahead and swallow the dairy food, okay? Because that is the lenient opinion of Tosos that we mentioned earlier, and also the Hilchos Gedolos, and they say that that's perfectly fine, okay? So we've also pointed out that if someone was ill, we would rely on these opinions to allow them to go ahead and eat at this time. And then he says further, it seems that even if you didn't go ahead and do the rinsing and washing, it will also be permitted to go ahead and eat the dairy food since he's already had the bracha on it. Because he has a further leniency that he says from the Shach and Peites Sivkat and Zion over here, that even without the rinsing and the washing, you could still go ahead and eat if you don't have any meat stuck in your teeth. Okay, he says nonetheless that it seems like it could be lenient in this case, but it could still use a little more investigation. Okay, so there's also reason to be lenient as well with less than an hour. Like the Ramah brings down, as long as you say the bracha achrona. So there's again, it's only if you made the bracha on the food, you need to eat it. What if you started eating and you started eating and you realize that it hasn't been 6 hours yet? You have to stop. So you already made the bracha, okay, and you're already eating this. So what do you do? Do you have to stop? So l'chora, with that, once you've already started eating, since you already have relied on the opinion, okay. So can you go ahead and finish that meal? So according to the lenient opinion, since you've made the bracha, since the whole point is that you've made the bracha, you can swallow this one. If you didn't realize it and you started eating, and you're already relying on the lenient opinion, you can go ahead and finish the meal according to that lenient opinion as well. So the question is, if I'm even allowed to start, right? Which is similar to a question of if I start with the Isser or Beheter. So there's a question if I'm allowed to do work before mincha. So technically, in certain instances, you have to stop your work and then daven mincha. Okay, so in those cases, we say even though you've started, you have to stop. And in some cases, we say since you started, even though it was with Isser, you can continue and finish it. So this would be a case probably similar to that, especially here since we're saying we're relying on people who literally permit you to do this. So you could go ahead and finish the meal. What if you have dentures? So the Aruch HaTshuva asked the question of dentures. And he says, yeah, you can go ahead and use dentures for both milk and meat. You don't need the separate ones. As always, you wait a certain time period and then clean them out as we've recommended. Especially since dentures are made from a very hard substance, they don't really absorb. So he compares them to glass, according to many opinions, but it doesn't absorb. And also, when you eat food, you also don't have it hot from a Kli Rishon. It's only Kli Sheni. Okay. So, however, it would be nice to have separate ones, or maybe at least have different ones for Pesach. So that's one stringency he has. The Sefer Marsham disagrees, and he says that if you're eating directly out of the Kli Rishon, you're going to have a problem. Okay. So that could potentially be a problem. So if you know the food is going to be really hot, then you should technically not have them in between the same food, in between the meat food and the dairy food. Okay? But if the food is not going to be that hot, it'll just be warm, okay, or tepid. So, we've already said that there's an opinion, that people don't eat food that's so hot, so you could be lenient on that. Okay, so in the Sefer of Mincha Shlomo, which is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, he says that the regular temperature of the mouth reduces the amount of temperature as it gets absorbed, and so therefore it's not going to ever be either number one absorbing in it, and even if it did get something hot in it, it's never going to be a problem of Yatzel spell. So lots of reasons to be lenient on that. Okay, so are there any restrictions that while you're fleshig, is there a restriction on you being around dairy food? Because you might come to eat it. So the Bir Halacha asked this question in Hilchos Shabbos in Reish Tes Zayin. Okay, so the Mishnah Berurah. So he says that if something is prohibited to be eaten, okay, you are allowed to still smell it. Okay, because there is only a prohibition of the eating, like when you're eating together, but not if it's just smelling it. Okay, and so from here we see that you can smell it, even if it's something prohibited, like the blood of a wild animal. Okay, and so this is not only his opinion, but he also quotes 4 other opinions as well. And he also says that this is why you can also smell prohibited things. He quotes the halacha in Yoreh Deah, Siman Kuf Ches 108, a reicha milsa. So we say that if you smell it, that's not the problem. So he does restrict himself a little bit by saying that if that thing is meant to be smelled, that's where the permission is. But if you're smelling something that's normally eaten, well, if it's like put in a plate or in a pot and you're smelling it, that's not the problem. It's only that we're putting it out for you to eat it. So if it's something that meant to be eaten and you put it out there might be a prohibition on smelling it because you might come to eat it. Okay, so he says that's his opinion. The Badi Shulchan quotes this. He says, therefore, one should check to see if what he's smelling is dairy. So within 6 hours, you should technically be stringent on that. Okay, but he says most people don't. No one has this as a stringency. Okay, so that's what the Badi Shulchan says. And let's see. He also has a little footnote over there. It says it's like a Shiloh, whatever. Nobody actually mentioned this as a stringency, and so as I always say about everything in the Badi Shulchan, it's a nice fact, but nobody has that minhag. Why? Because this would be making a zerich to a gezerah. So it's not really prohibited for you to eat it, as you've seen from a number of poskim. It's that we just don't eat it. It's not prohibited. It's even after an hour, be mutter. So the premise of the Badi Shulchan is flawed. Another fun thing for the Badi Shulchan. So what about if you have children and people who are ill? He asked the question that if a child has reached the age of chinuch, let's say 6 or 7 or 8, how long do you have to have them wait in between meals? Okay. So, meaning how long should they wait between meat and milk? So he says that when they're younger, you don't have to wait an hour, okay? Because children, they need to eat, so they're considered a little bit like an ill person. So if they need to eat, they need to eat. But he's saying that by age 9, you need to be very strict with them, okay? So and definitely by 10, for sure. Okay, but if they're a little bit younger to wait, you don't have to be so strict. But once they're above 10, you should make them wait the full 6 hours, and he's Mr. 6 hours. But if your minhag is to do less than that, the children follow the minhag of the household. Okay, let's see. So I also have a note over here from Rav Yosef Shalom Elyashiv, and it says that 3-year-olds need not wait at all. Between 3 to 6, you should make them wait about an hour, like the Ramah. And after 6 until about 9, you should definitely be pretty picky about about 3 hours. And then once they're over 9, they should start really keeping the 6 hours. So that was a recommendation by the former head of the Eda HaChareis, Yosef Shalom Elyashiv. Aruch Shulchan says that if a person is actually ill, so you can actually do only the hour, and so he says that, and this is also echoed by the Chachmas Adam and the Pri Toar and the Chassam Sofer. Okay, and the Chassam Sofer's tshuva is Siman Ayin Gimel, and so the main thing is that the doctor has to say that he needs to eat something dairy. Okay, but if you don't have to have dairy. It's just that he's sick. Then you should wait at least 3 hours. Okay, and this I also have a note over here that this was asked of Rav Elyashiv. That's all. Now that we've given you a bazillion rules about this, let's see what the actual language is of the Mechaber and the Ramah, so we understand the final halacha. So the Mechaber says, this is in Sif Aleph, If you eat achal basar, so if you eat meat, even if it's from a non-domesticated animal like deer or fowl like chicken, you may not eat dairy afterwards until you've waited 6 hours after the meat meal. Okay, and so if you've waited 6 hours, you still have meat between your teeth, you must remove it, and so therefore a person who chews for a child also has to wait. So the Ramah adds, he says, if you find the Ramah says, you find the meat, anything out, rinse your mouth out also. Okay, and then he says, now, that the Ein Strichen we don't have to wait 6 hours, says the Ramah. So he says, even though people are strict about the kinuach and hadacha, we just mentioned by removing the meat, we say that the whole waiting of hours is not a requirement. So it says our custom is to only wait about an hour. And then after that meat meal, you go ahead and have cheese. Mihu. And therefore you have to have the benching after your meat meal. That's when it becomes a new meal. So he's going on that fact. Why is it the new meal, the next meal, the new thing? The mutter lechol l'divrei ha'ama akilan, because that would be the way in which we would conduct ourselves according to the lenient opinions. But without changing the meal, waiting the hour doesn't suffice. The hour is not predicated on Berachas Hamazon, you simply have to say it. And he also agrees that if there's meat in between the teeth, you must remove it. However, you shouldn't bench in order to eat cheese. Okay? Aval ain't his harm is that. But we're not so careful about this. If there are some people who are strict to wait the full 6 hours after the meat before eating cheese, and that's a nice thing to do. Okay? So the Mechaber says flat out that between the two shitos, he's going to take both Rashi's opinion about the waiting with the meat between the teeth, and like Rashi, which is going to be the flavor coming up from within the body. Okay, so even if you wait, you also have to take out the meat from between your teeth. So you see that's the two of them together. So there's one thing that's interesting though, is that he'll say later on in If Gimel that if you eat soup, right, you have meat soup, you don't have to wait all this time. So it seems like not like Rashi. So what he's saying there is that let's say you fried eggs in beef fat, okay? So it's just the flavor of the meat and not actually meat itself. So he's saying that's something different. So the Beis Yosef himself deals with that, and we'll talk about that more when we get there. Okay? And the Ramah says that the Iker Halacha is neither like Rashi or the Rambam, but rather like Tosfos. Okay? So what about waiting after chicken? You have to do that. So the Mechaber and the Ramah agree with both the Rashra and most Rishonim that rule is equivalent, okay, to beef as well. And not like that Ramban we mentioned earlier. I mentioned that Ramban in the previous year. And you also have to wait 6 hours, according to everybody. That's Rashi, Rif, Rambam, Rashra, Rush, and all those guys. Okay? That you have to wait the full 6 hours. But the Ramah says that you can go ahead and take the lenient opinion of Tosfos and the Hilchos Gedolos after an hour, and if it's just nice to wait the 6 hours, okay? So he says that there's a big difference of opinion over there. Okay, so just so you know, even though I'm saying that's what their opinions are, we don't actually paskin like that, okay? So before we get to that, let's talk about Birchas Hamazon. So the Birchas Hamazon says that that if you don't remove the meat meal before having the dairy one, then you're not allowed to go ahead and have your dairy meal. even though you've waited your hour. And the Taz, the Pri Megadim, and the Shach all agree with this. Okay, that you have to have benching. However, they don't agree with his assessment of only waiting the 1 hour. So the Taz actually says that even if you are going to go ahead and immediately change meals, that would be fine, which seems to imply that benching and changing over the table is an important part of moving on to the next meal. Okay? So that seems to be the main thing, is that you have to get yourself ready to go into a new meal. So benching is part of that, but you also have to go ahead and get ready for the next meal, which doesn't involve any of the meat stuff that's been on the table up until this time. The Pri Megadim says on this Taz that's even if you're, according to the stringent opinion, that you have to wait over here, meaning that in a case like on Shavuos, okay, and if you've gone ahead and had a dairy meal first, and now you want to have your meat meal, okay, in honor of the holiday. So according to the Taz, that would work, even though we're saying that you really shouldn't do that, because you're not really getting up from the meal. You're going to have one long meal. So, but the Taz is only saying that between meat and milk. But that's why on Shavuos you should have the dairy meal first. Okay, you'll have the dairy meal first. And the Ramah is also taking the lenient approach we mentioned in the tour. That's like you don't have to look for the meat, whereas the Beis Yosef brought down the Rashba, you have to look for the meat. Okay, so that was another important thing. That's one bit of a difference. So let's take a look at some important things over here. So the Darkei Tshuva writes about when the Mechaber says that you have to wait 6 hours, no matter what type of meat it is. And even if you accidentally eat something that's not kosher, you have to wait. Okay, that's what he says over there. But you don't have to wait the 6 hours. I'm sorry. If you eat something I'm sorry. He says if you eat something that's not kosher, it's like a nevela or a treifa of a kosher thing, you have to wait the 6 hours. But if you accidentally eat something that's a non-kosher animal, like pork, you don't have to wait the 6 hours. Okay. So that is his opinion. He brings that down. There are a lot of people there are some people who disagree with him, who basically say that if you eat something not kosher, there's no requirement to wait because there's no prohibition of basar b'chalav added onto that, and we saw that earlier. So some people basically say if there's no prohibition of basar b'chalav in those cases, the waiting 6 hours is immaterial. Okay, so the 6 hours, we talked about this previously. So the Pri Megadim says it has to be 6 full hours or 60 minutes. We brought down a whole list of other people who agree that it needs to be 6 hours, but not exactly 6 hours. But the Pri Chodesh brought down that you could just do 4 hours. Okay, and then then we also said that not everybody agrees that the 6 hours are 6 full hours as well. Just go refer back to the last year. So when you chew for a child, you have to wait. So the Shach says that if you chew up meat for a child, that there's also fattiness in it, and you swallow that fattiness. Well, that's according to everybody. So then there's really no issue over there. So that would be something else. Okay, so but the idea is that you should be brings on that you should be strict and not try to make any leniencies in this case. That's the Mechaber. And what the Ramah? The Ramah said that if you do find some meat between your teeth, you have to take it out and rinse your mouth out. So the Shach says on this that this is from the Ran. We quoted that Ran earlier. And you don't really need the 6 hours from the moment you take it out of your mouth, okay? But even from when you start eating, okay? And this is also brought down by the Darkei Moshe in his work Toras Chatas, okay? And the Shach quotes that. And that is even applicable to the minhag of waiting 1 hour as well, and it would also apply to the minhag, which is more common for us, of waiting 6 hours. The Shach also adds that according to this Ran, that you have to rinse out your mouth, and he doesn't rinse. You have to rinse out your mouth. Doesn't mention scrubbing out your mouth at all. Okay, so he says there's kinuach hapeh, but not hadachas hapeh. So you have to kind of wipe out your mouth, but don't have to rinse out your mouth. And this is actually an interesting point that's made by the Beis Yosef in Orach Chaim and Kufay and Gimel. And the Torah's Chata says it again. So, which is to basically say that you don't really need to fully rinse your mouth out and do a full scrubby. However, that's what the Ran holds. Now, our opinion was to say, not like this Ran, and therefore the Shach requires us to say that you have to do a full kinuach b'hadach. You don't have to wipe off your mouth. You also have to rinse out your mouth. And so you probably also need to do a little scrubbing in there, okay, or swishing around. Okay, and so you need as much as possible to clean out the mouth. And so basically, as long as you're doing that, you should also take a look to see if there's any meat in there as well. So basically taking the best of all worlds and saying you have to really check your mouth very thoroughly. So when we said that you don't have to really wait the 6 hours in the Ramah, okay, so the Shach says that if you eat meat not in the middle of a meal, you still have to say the bracha achrona, which we mentioned a moment ago. And he further says that removing your meat plates and saying the bracha achrona requires you to also do the wiping and cleaning of the mouth as well. Okay, so the Ramah further says that the minhag is to wait the 1 hour. So the Shach and the Taz say that that's not the minhag. Okay, I mentioned that briefly, but they all say that's not the case. The Taz says it's in Sifkat and Beis, and the Shach says it also right here that this is not the case. Okay, and so the minhag is like that. So our minhag is not like that. And he also quotes the Marshal that you really should tell people that it's wrong to not wait the full 6 hours. That's what he says. So, and he says, but mostly people who are going to listen to you. So they're B'nai Torah is what he says. If they listen to you, you should tell them it's appropriate to wait the 6 hours. So that's the case. However, if you wait only the hour, you have to do the rinsing out, but you really can't fight with them. Okay. The Ramah further said, we mentioned that he says that you have to say Berachos Hamazon afterwards. And that's according to Tosfos, like we said, was the Tosfos' opinion, the lenient opinion. So, the Taz seems to not be so worried about removing all the stuff from the table. So the Pri Toa, however, adds a little thing over here that he says that in a few places, they don't see this as being necessarily an important part of Tosfos' opinion, but it seems that it made it in there, so they don't feel that you have to absolutely remove everything out of there. So the Ramah adds at the end that really should be more stringent than wait the 6 hours. And the Shach says that that's what the Marshal says, so we see that that's the case. So we talked about the different time periods. So let's kind of roll through and explain Sif Aleph here. In more detail. So, because this kind of explains the 6 hours over here. So we saw in the Gemara that it's us to eat cheese after meat. When you have to wait for another meal, and so we saw that everybody has a different opinion about what that means. Rashi says you have to wait for the meat flavor to leave. Tosfos says that you have to have a brand new meal. Okay. And the Rambam says you have to get rid of the meat that's inside of your teeth. Okay? And so we said that was talks about the difference between having removed the meat from between your teeth. According to Rashi, it's not such a big deal. According to the Rambam, it is a big deal. You have to remove it. It also means that if you have soup, we'll see that there's the difference between according to Rashi and Rambam. We'll talk about that in Sif Gimel when we get to it. Rashi's like, soup's a big deal, right? Rambam's like, there's no meat between your teeth. What are you worried about? Okay? So another thing is that if you have fake teeth, okay, so Rashi doesn't care what your teeth do, and the Rambam cares about your teeth. So we saw that, we already had a discussion on that. Meat in between your teeth, Rashi doesn't care about that, the Rambam does care about that. Okay. What about swallowing meat without chewing it? So Rashi would care, the Rambam wouldn't care. So these are just important things to know about why the halacha is structured this way. So we say about waiting after certain types of food, you have to wait 6 hours. So Tosfos says that there's no idea of waiting 6 hours. That you can just have to go ahead and eat one right after the other. Okay. But he says there's an even bigger leniency when it's just fowl and it's like chicken or whatever. You don't have to require all the washing and other handling. But if it's meat, you don't have to wait until after you bench, and you can do that. Okay. And that's what Tosfos says. And the Ramban is even more lenient to basically say you can't eat them together, but you don't have to wait at all. There's not even washing your hands or anything like that. Okay, and with also from animal like venison and so on, also no problem. But the Rambam, the Rashba, all these people, they say it doesn't matter if it's actual Torah prohibited meat or rabbinic prohibited meat. The rule's all the same. You have to wait the 6 hours. Okay, and we passing like that. And Rashi, the Rif, the Ran, the Rush, the Hagos, Ashri, the Rambam, the Rashba, the Mordechai, the Ravya, you have to wait 6 hours. Now, the Beinu Tam and Hilchos Gedolos that were brought in Tosfos, they say you don't have to wait 6 hours. So that's the different thing. Okay? Now, we saw in the Acharim that there's different approaches to the 6 hour thing. So, we saw in the Piskei Maharai and the Hagos Yoreh Deah that they just do an hour. So this is their thing. It's not really Tosfos. It's not really the other one. Okay. So the Pri Chadash and the Gra say this minhag found its source in the Zohar, but it just means that the people had such a custom. The Aruch HaShulchan says that you can rely on this opinion in times of illness. Okay. If you do wait only an hour, you still have to clean out your mouth and clean out your hands, and you shouldn't have any meat stuck within your teeth. Now, there's another custom of people who wait 3 hours. This is brought in the Mizmor David, okay? And so the 3 hours is because they said, hey, it's Shaus Manios. So 6 hours is only 3 hours, all right? So in Eastern France and in Southern Germany, that's where they had it. And also people who live in Algiers, that's what this was all common. Nowadays, also people who have removed themselves in those areas in South Africa have that as well. They say 3 hours. The Pri Chadash brings down 4 hours. Okay? And so the Minchas Yaakov is one of the only Achorim who says the Pri Chadash's opinion is okay as well. Okay? So I brought another opinion over here. Reb Chaim Brisker says that 5.5 hours is like 6, so he doesn't agree with the Pri Megadim. Sorry, Pri Megadim says you need 6 full hours. 6 minutes, 6 hours is 60-minute hours. The Reb Chaim Brisker is not strict on that. You only have to wait for 5 hours and 30 plus minutes. And there's also the opinion of Gines Varadim, the Divrei Chachamim, Rav Yoshev, and Rabbi Vaja Yosef, who all say that you don't need really 6 hours. You need 5 hours and a little bit more. It's just be into the 6 hour. Okay. And we also talked about the people who kind of dispute when you start counting. Everyone agrees that you count it from the moment you stop eating meat. Okay. However, the Aruch HaShulchan says you don't have to wait until after Birchas Hamazon. You just have to stop eating the meat. So people tend to agree with that. After 6 hours, you find meat between your teeth. So we brought down the Taz, the Pri Megadim, the Shach, that says this is the Machlokes Rashi and the Rambam, but that you should still do it because we're choshesh for the opinion of the Rambam, and therefore should always check. And then it's not really their chiddush; they're quoting the Marashal. They also say that you should also remove stuff from the table, from the meal as well, not only from between your teeth. So those are the two things as well. Okay, and even without meat, it's not just benching that you do; it's any bracha achrona. So the one last thing is that we see that we take both opinions, Rashi and the Rambam, but that's according to the Mechaber, and all the Acharim agree you should do that. The Rambam brings down a leniency of 1 hour, holding like Tosfos, with a little bit more from the Maharai, but we don't hold like that. Okay, so we said the Shach and Taz, I'll say, they quote the Marashal saying you really should do the 6, like the Ramah says at the end, don't rely on the 1. Okay, so that is the thing. They also say that if you haven't cleared the table, but you've benched the Bracha Achrona, you still aren't allowed to eat the next meal. And you also need to make sure that you clean out your teeth. You don't have to necessarily do it the full thing, but you need to make sure there's no meat between your teeth. You don't have to rinse out your mouth. So we have that leniency from the Ramah, which is unlike the Rosh, which said you have to make sure there's none of that in there. Okay, next time we'll talk about in the second half of pay tests over here, if you can, if it's permitted to eat meat after having cheese. So we're going to talk about the other direction as well. This will be an interesting discussion. It'll be a little bit shorter. And we'll also talk about washing your hands after having had a meat meal. A little shorter, but interesting material. Until next time.